Greetings, my dear viewer. You're on the channel The Price of Cheating. The channel is for those who appreciate traditional family values and condemn adultery. So be sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. When Diane paused, her gaze fixed on him, John responded with a tired, "I understand." He couldn't remember when he had started saying those words so often. The phrase felt like a drumbeat in his recent conversations with her, and he was weary of repeating it. It troubled him how he and Diane had reached this fragile point after more than 2 decades together. They'd built a life over 26 years, raised 2 children now away at college, and lived in a beautiful old home Diane had inherited from her grandmother. Together, they had transformed that home, making it their own. They'd added a pool, remodeled the interiors into an open concept, and upgraded the kitchen until it looked like something from a TV design show. John was proud of the result, convinced it could rival anything on HGTV. They also owned a cherished beach house in Hatteras, North Carolina, a place John had inherited and insisted on leaving unchanged. It was an anchor of family memories, preserved exactly as he remembered it from his childhood. Professionally, life seemed just as rewarding. John, now a senior vice president in central logistics, enjoyed the hard-won fruits of his career. Diane, too, was successful, serving as a senior account executive at Richards & Son, a securities firm where she had worked for 2 decades. They had a lovely home, good children, thriving careers, and a seemingly happy marriage, or so he thought, until these recent conversations, where "I understand" had become his reluctant mantra. Diane studied him, silent, as if searching his face. "Do you understand what I'm trying to say?" she asked again. "I understand," he replied, though he hoped she hadn't seen the little mark he'd unconsciously made on the paper in front of him. When he looked down, he counted 32 marks. 32 times in the last 2 days he had said those words to her. He was tired of this cycle. Finally, Diane took a deep breath. "So, we've reached an understanding," she said, her voice steady. "I'll step outside our marriage once, just to experience it." John shook his head, meeting her gaze firmly. "No! I won't agree to this, Diane. I won't betray you, and I can't let you betray me." She seemed genuinely surprised and a little defensive. "I've never cheated on you," she protested. John pressed forward. "I'm willing to move past what's happened already, but no more," he said, trying to keep his tone calm. Diane's expression hardened. "I haven't cheated on you," she countered, though a shadow crossed her face. John continued, his voice measured. "I believe, at least in my eyes, you have. You've gone to dinners alone with him, met him on so-called girls' nights that turned into something more. You've kept up texting him, especially over weekends. That's not innocent." Diane's eyes lowered, and John felt a mix of sadness and frustration. He could see where her actions were leading, as clear as if it were spelled out in front of him. The luxury suite she had booked at the Jefferson Hotel, the 2 brunch reservations, her new dress hidden in the closet, and lingerie tucked into a discreet bag. Purchases clearly not meant for him. He went on, his voice even but edged with finality. "Let's make this clear. I'm offering 2 choices. This Saturday I'll head to the beach house. I'll stop for breakfast on the way, and then I'll be at the beach. I'd love it if you came with me. We can spend the weekend talking, figuring out if we can still make this work. Maybe return the lingerie you bought and bring something back that's meant for us." He waited, watching her, but couldn't read her expression as easily as he once could. "Or," he said, "you can follow through with your plans. Go to the Jefferson Hotel with David Summers, have dinner at Bookbinders, dance at the Tobacco Company Club, and see where the night leads." She looked up at him, finally meeting his gaze, her expression one of disbelief. "If you choose to follow through with him," he continued, "you won't need my permission because once I leave on Saturday without you, this marriage will be over." Diane stared at him, bewildered. She struggled to speak, her mind racing, trying to comprehend how he had known every detail of the plans she thought were secret. Before Diane could respond, John spoke up first. "If you're curious, I have friends at your office. You have friends who genuinely care about you there," he said. "But David Summers? He has no real friends at all." Diane froze as John's words registered. Determined to regain control of the conversation, she countered. I've been a loyal wife and partner to you for 22 years. No, John replied flatly. You've been a faithful wife for 21 years and 10 months. You've been unfaithful since that first lunch with David Summers. Diane felt herself grow defensive. I haven't cheated on you, she insisted. But John pressed on. You've already crossed the line with him, haven't you? Diane stood abruptly, cutting him off. I did not cheat on you, she said firmly. John's face softened, yet sadness filled his eyes as he continued. I saw the change in your eyes. They used to stay locked on mine when we made love, but now you turn away, close them, and your face retreats from me in bed. How many times were you with him in spirit when you were with me? He let out a somber laugh. Remember when we used to fantasize about a threesome? You've practically fulfilled that now. Only this time the fantasy is overcrowded with him. But I'm done talking about it, Diane. Do you understand? This wasn't the direction Diane had expected. She tried once more to steer the conversation her way. John, we have a wonderful life together. Our marriage has been strong. We've raised 2 amazing kids. We both have great careers, and if we stay on track, we can retire early and enjoy a full life together. I cherish our relationship and love, and I want to stay by your side as a devoted wife for the rest of our lives. I'm ready to give you all my days. Just allow me 1 day for myself. She hesitated before adding, and 1 night for him. John's reply was immediate. 1 night for him? He scoffed. You've had more than 1 night's worth of intimacy with him in your mind right under my nose. Diane lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. I could have kept this hidden from you, John. I could have lied, but I wanted to be honest. I thought that, after all our years together, you would understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, he replied coldly. You've already lied to me for months. You've been slipping away to meet him under false pretenses, attending supposed bachelorette parties that were really dates with him. You shared private dinners, hands entwined, giving him access to parts of you that belonged to me. And what's worse, you brought thoughts of him into our own bed, disrupting our moments with constant messages and sexts. I know everything, Diane, and it doesn't matter how I found out. What matters is if you understand what you're jeopardizing, do you? Diane's expression grew distant, her gaze empty. John realized with a hollow ache that she couldn't fully grasp what was at stake. He rose, leaving the room in silence. He went to their bedroom, brushed his teeth, and tried to sleep, though he doubted he'd find rest that night. Diane stayed motionless for several minutes. Finally, she reached for her phone and dialed her friend, Janice. When Janice picked up, Diane spoke softly. John knows everything. He knows about David and our plans for the weekend. Janice's response was swift. That's bad, Diane. Are you going to cancel it? Diane hesitated. I don't know if I can. I already promised David, and he's spent a lot on this weekend. Janice's tone grew firm. Diane, you made vows to John long before this. I was there, remember? I was your maid of honor. David can back out any time. It won't cost him anything. Janice paused, then continued. Besides, that's no excuse to betray John. I'm not cheating on him, Diane whispered. You are cheating, Diane, Janice replied with finality. When I told you about what George and I did, I made it clear that I'd never have gone through with it without his consent. We chose together, and we made sure it was with someone we'd never see again. I told you we followed every step correctly, yet we're still facing problems we need to work through. You chose to be with a coworker, and now you're trying to rationalize it. Janice was pleading with her. Forget this plan. Stop seeing David. Get down on your knees and apologize to John, Janice urged. Diane responded in a low voice. But I need this. I need to know what it's like to be with another man again in my life. David's a good guy, and everyone at work says he's great in bed. Janice shook her head. A good guy wouldn't go after a married woman. Consider what you're putting at risk just to be another tick on his list. Diane argued. I won't just be a mark on his list. He's paying attention to me. Janice wanted to yell into the phone. Don't you see how that makes it even worse? I met David at our bachelorette party. He's attractive, sure, but he's nothing compared to John. You know that, right? Diane murmured. I get it. Janice pressed. Think carefully about this choice. It will change the lives of everyone you care about. Diane sighed. I thought you'd understand. Of all people, I thought you'd get why I feel I need to do this. Janice tried one more time. Diane, it's not that I don't understand. It's not that John doesn't understand. It's not about your kids or family or friends not understanding. The issue is that you don't understand. Diane replied, resolved. Well, John knows about everything I've been doing and he hasn't stopped me. He won't be happy, but he'll let me do it because he knows how much it matters to me. Now I really need some sleep. Ending the call, Janice looked at her husband, George. She didn't understand anything I tried to tell her, she murmured. George sighed. I wish I hadn't told her about what happened with us. I thought we'd agreed that would stay between us. Janice flushed slightly. I just needed someone to talk to about our problems. I didn't think it would give her any ideas. George put an arm around her. I know. I'm not upset. Janice's gaze dropped. So, you told John? I can only imagine what he said. Did he suggest dumping me or branding me with a scarlet letter? George smiled. You know John better than that. He asked me a series of questions. As I answered them, I started to think about us more seriously. Then he said, You both got into this together. It was a mutual decision that turned into a major mistake, but only you two can work to fix it. He continued, John made me see that as long as we're both trying to fix things together, we'll be okay. That realization might be the reason we're still together now. Janice's eyes filled with tears. That might be the reason we're still here, and it might also be the reason he's headed for a divorce. George held her close and whispered, If they separate, don't take it on yourself. John's right. If they don't face their issues together, there's no hope. That night, Diane slipped into bed to find John lying awake, his back turned to her. They both shifted to opposite edges of the bed, 2 feet between them that felt like an unbridgeable gulf. In the morning, they went through their routines in silence. After Diane left for work, John took a moment to relax and went over the list he held in his hands. He had arranged to take Friday and Monday off from work. John moved from room to room, photographing each space and documenting its contents. He carefully listed each item, marking those he planned to keep. He downloaded all of their family and wedding photos from the cloud, storing them on a flash drive, but left their wedding album on the coffee table, unable to bring himself to open it. The apartments he toured were nice enough, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he would miss this house. Though he would carry the memories, he knew he would miss the place itself, and above all, the woman he still loved and the life they had built together within these walls. John met with Sandra Lewis, his attorney, whom others had recommended highly. She presented a straightforward settlement plan. Diane would keep the house and her retirement account, while John would keep their beach house and his own retirement savings. John would also pay off her car and their joint credit card debt. They agreed to set aside a portion of their investments for college funds, plus $10,000 for each child to start a charitable fund, and then divide the remaining assets equally. John glanced up after reviewing the proposal and nodded. Sandra told him they could file the paperwork by Wednesday morning. He nodded again, shook her hand, and left the office. Sandra noted that John had spoken very little to her throughout the divorce process, communicating mostly through email. She could sense the sadness and humility he carried. Moments like these often made her question her career choice in family law. John then went to the bank, where he opened a separate account, transferring half of their joint funds into it. He emailed his HR department with a request to redirect his direct deposit to the new account, then planned to update his payment information at home later. Afterward, he met with their investment banker, who informed him that both he and Diane would need to sign for any future transactions on their accounts. John explained that Sandra Lewis would initiate control over the accounts once Diane was officially served. He was unsettled by the sympathetic expressions on the faces of his longtime advisors, realizing they were the first of many people who would react this way as word of the divorce spread. The thought of explaining it to his children left him feeling sick. Meanwhile, Diane did her best to avoid David Summers at work. They met during lunch at Maria's cafe, a small place he liked to call their spot. She stayed quiet, unwilling to hold his hand, sensing John's presence in every move she made. All day she had been haunted by the feeling of being watched. David, however, seemed oblivious to her discomfort. "I'm really looking forward to this weekend," he said excitedly. "Check-in is at 3 p.m. Any chance we could meet up a little earlier? Maybe have some time alone before dinner?" Diane replied softly, "I don't think so." Back at her desk, she tried to work but found herself constantly glancing around, feeling that a few of her co-workers might be watching her for John. Frustrated and unproductive, she decided to call it a day. In the hallway, she greeted two new interns in her department, pausing when she noticed that one wore a Central Logistics sweatshirt. She instantly recognized it as a subtle reminder of John's presence. John, meanwhile, had finished everything on his to-do list. Realizing he hadn't eaten all day, he headed to Maria's cafe. The hostess greeted him with a warm hug. "How's Ben doing?" John asked. Maria smiled. "He's great. He made the baseball team as a freshman and couldn't be happier." "James has loved practicing with him all winter," John replied. "He's thrilled to have his roommate on the team with him." Maria took a seat beside John, adding, "They were here for lunch earlier, but it wasn't exactly a happy scene. Diane seemed nervous, and, as usual, Summers seemed clueless." "He's probably clueless, but he'll still end up in her bed this weekend," John muttered with a hint of resignation. "Don't be so quick to give up," Maria encouraged. "She must mean a lot to you if you've been married this long. She'll realize her mistake. I just hope it's sooner rather than later." Then, after a pause, she asked, "Maryland-style crab cakes with broccoli?" For the first time that day, John managed a small smile. "Sounds just right. Maybe add a beer, something different. Surprise me with one of those pale ales." Meanwhile, Diane arrived home earlier than expected, ready to set her backup plan into action. She would cook John's favorite meal and try once again to bridge the distance between them. Getting him to agree to this one-time date was crucial, but if he couldn't, at the very least, she hoped he could accept her decision. Once the crab cakes were ready, she went upstairs, carefully selecting an outfit she knew he'd like. Her plan for the evening included meeting her friends Janice and Lisa for a drink, one last talk before Saturday's big decision. She quietly packed a few bags from her closet into her car trunk, Victoria's Secret, among others, doing her best to avoid embarrassing either of them. John came home at his usual time, pleasantly surprised by the aroma wafting from the kitchen. Diane handed him a bottle of light beer as he walked into the living room. "Take off your jacket and tie," she said, gesturing to the sofa. "Dinner will be ready in just a few minutes." When he saw the familiar plate of Maryland crab cakes with broccoli on the table, he felt a brief moment of gratitude. It was his favorite meal, after all. Yet for the first time, he found himself wishing he were at Maria's cafe instead. Anywhere but here, really. As they ate in silence, Diane finally gathered her courage to speak. "John, I love you. I really hope you can understand why I need to do this." Before she could say more, he interrupted, his tone flat. "I get it." His gaze flickered over her. "You look nice tonight. Going out?" "Yes, I'm meeting Janice and Lisa for a couple of drinks." Diane's voice softened. "But John, I'm telling you this because I love you and I need—" Yeah, he said, brushing her off, the coldness in his tone sharp. "You want me to understand, I do." He pushed his plate away, standing up. "I'm done. Lost my appetite." He glanced at her one last time. "You look really good. Guess you couldn't wait for tomorrow. And when you see David Summers, tell him I said he can drop dead." He turned and left, heading for the living room, and the sound of the television soon filled the silence she left behind. Diane stayed seated, wrapping her arms around herself as a wave of doubt washed over her for the first time. After a few moments, she rose, clearing away the remnants of their dinner. Now was not the moment for second thoughts. She had to stay firm. She texted Janice, "Can we meet earlier? Leaving in 5. John heard the door click shut, her footsteps fading outside. He sat there, staring at the TV screen, realizing he'd been mindlessly watching for almost 20 minutes. The crushing sadness weighed down on him, so heavy it seemed to suffocate. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a small box, shaking 2 pills into his palm and washing them down with the rest of his beer. This was new. He'd never taken sleeping pills before. But tonight, he knew he'd need them, just as he knew he'd need all his energy to face Saturday. Diane arrived first at the bar, arranging a table for three and waiting as her eyes took in the scene around her. Men and women moved in a choreography of seduction, though to her it looked like a display of desperation and solitude. Was this really the future she was choosing? But as her friends approached, she put those thoughts aside. Observing their expressions, she prepared herself. They looked tense, and she braced herself for what was sure to be a difficult conversation. Lisa sat back and fixed Diana with a hard stare. "What on earth are you thinking? Have you completely lost it? Are you seriously planning to betray your husband with some lowlife from work? Is this a midlife crisis, or did you take a blow to the head?" She shook her head, baffled. "This has to be the dumbest idea I've ever heard, and coming from someone as smart as you, I'm shocked. If you actually go through with this, you're not who I thought you were." Diana gave her a dry smile. "Well, good evening to you too, Lisa. I'm doing fine. How are you?" Lisa just stared, her disapproval clear. Diana glanced over at Janice, looking for a lifeline. Janice sighed, shaking her head. "Diana, you know how I feel about this whole adventure of yours. I'd say more, but I'd probably sound even less polite than Lisa." Diana managed a sad smile. "Think you could outswear her?" Janice didn't smile. No one curses like Lisa, but even she left out betrayer, cheater, fool, and disappointment. "And I have to be honest. I think you're heading for the biggest mistake of your life. But I love you, and I'll be here, no matter what." Lisa just groaned. "This is beyond stupid, but yeah, I'll be here for you too. Just don't expect me not to say I told you so." Diana wrapped her arms around them both. "Thank you. I know you don't approve, but it means a lot to have your support anyway. You both know I don't do things halfway. I've committed to this, and I'm seeing it through to the end." Lisa's tone softened. "Diana, there's nothing natural about infidelity, and you know that committing to cheating just mocks the word commitment." Diana sat quietly, absorbing her friend's words before finally standing up. "I've got things to wrap up for tomorrow. Let me grab a bottle of wine. Stay and have a glass with me." Later, Diana finished her errands and pulled up to her darkened house. She texted Janice, knowing she'd hear her out despite her anger. Opening her car trunk, she remembered the things she'd bought. Leaving them in the car overnight would ruin them in the cold. She stored them in the downstairs closet, and then slipped into bed beside John, hoping for sleep that refused to come. Hours later, at 3 a.m., she gave up, quietly heading downstairs. Her gaze fell on their wedding album on the coffee table. She figured if John could look at it someday, so could she. After barely skimming 2 pages, she shut it and broke down in tears. Somehow, she had to make him understand. By 5 a.m., she gave up on sleep entirely and took a long, hot shower. She slipped into her new lingerie, then put on the outfit she had carefully chosen. Grabbing her packed suitcase and a Victoria's Secret bag, she went to the kitchen and wrote John a quick note. The irony struck her, and she chuckled. She was leaving him a classic Dear John letter. Setting the note by the coffee maker, she switched off the lights and left the house, determined to see things through. Meanwhile, John woke at 6:15 a.m. Reaching over, he found her side of the bed empty, and it hit him. She hadn't come back. His mind raced, picturing her in David Summers' bed, and the thought cut deep. For the first time, he doubted himself. Would it have been better to let her experience what she needed, even if it meant losing her, if only for a night? She had promised she would come back, but now he wasn't sure he wanted her to. Had he sacrificed a lifetime of happiness to his own pride? As John looked back on the situation, he realized that he could never love her again if she chose David Summers. He could live with her prioritizing her children. That was what any mother should do. But he couldn't bear the thought of her choosing another man over her husband. Their 22 years together had built a foundation of respect and loyalty. She had always counted on that from him. He expected nothing less in return. Hoping she'd be home, he checked every bedroom, but there was no trace of her. Finally, he stepped into the kitchen, where a note was left on the coffee maker. With a heavy heart, he read her brief message. Please understand. John sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed with emotion. He dreaded the possibility that she might actually leave, yet a part of him clung to the hope that she'd stay, abandon this reckless idea, and remain his wife. He poured himself a coffee and went upstairs, feeling the weight of her absence. After a quick shower, he got dressed, packed some clothes in a duffel bag, and headed downstairs. Filling a thermos with coffee, he walked to the front door. He took a final, lingering look at the home that had been his sanctuary, then turned off the lights and stepped into the brisk morning. The cold air hit him, a sudden shock, but perhaps it was just what he needed to snap himself out of his stupor. As he approached his car, he realized the engine was already running. Opening the back door to stow his bag, he was surprised to see a suitcase and a Victoria's Secret bag in the back seat. Glancing to the passenger side, he saw Diane sleeping, curled up in the car. John closed the door softly, overcome with emotion as he watched her. His heart filled with relief. There was still hope for them. Taking a deep breath, he opened the car door and got inside. Diane stirred and looked up at him. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice soft as she wiped sleep from her eyes. "Good morning," he replied. After a brief silence, he asked, "How long have you been waiting here?" Diane checked her watch and said, "About 2 hours. I couldn't sleep, and I was worried you'd leave without me, so I decided to wait in the car. I filled up the tank and got us some Krispy Kreme donuts for the road." John opened the box and chuckled. "Looks like there are only 7 left." Diane, more awake now, smiled. "A dozen was for 2. I already ate my share." Laughing, John took one of the donuts and let its sweetness linger. It would tide him over until they could stop for breakfast at the Virginia diner. "How do you feel about their country ham and biscuits?" he asked, testing the waters. Diane shook her head. "I'm not exactly dressed for Virginia diner." John looked at her puzzled. "Diane, you can wear anything you want there. No one cares." She smiled, playful now. "Maybe so, but you can't wear almost nothing." She unzipped her coat, revealing a deep purple set of lingerie beneath. John's eyes widened. "It's almost nothing," he agreed, smiling. "Is the coat new?" "Yes," she said. "I traded in that dress for this coat. And in case you missed the Victoria's Secret bag, I returned the other items and got these just for you." She lifted his chin, her eyes locking with his. "This is for you, this and everything beneath it, for all the days and nights of our lives." She took a deep breath and added, "I'm sorry for what I put you through these last months. You were right about almost everything." She paused, then continued, "There were 2 things you got wrong, though. Last night, I dressed up for you, not anyone else. And yes, I did meet with Janice and Lisa. But as for David, I never brought him into our bed. I never closed my eyes to imagine him. The truth is, I couldn't meet your gaze because I was ashamed of my intentions. The shame didn't stop me from wanting to be with him, though, and that's what I regret." In a quiet voice, she said, "Now I truly understand." John looked at her, his heart swelling, and kissed her. They had much to discuss and a long road to rebuild their relationship. But John's heart lifted as he sensed that Diane finally understood. As he drove past the familiar Virginia diner, he glanced over at Diane, who had drifted off to sleep not long after they hit the highway. His thoughts wandered back to everything that had happened on Friday. John knew that if they were to have an honest conversation, he'd have to come clean. A memory surfaced from 7 years before, when he had been in San Francisco for a quarterly corporate meeting. At that time, he was a department head, and his latest initiative had just reaped a significant reward for the company. Foreign corporations were rapidly buying out American firms, but John had seen a promising opportunity in it. He'd advocated for the acquisition of a financially struggling Italian firm known for its talented engineers. With his mentor's approval, the CEO backed the deal, which ultimately became a remarkable success. This acquisition not only brought skilled engineering teams into the fold, but opened doors to the European market and gave the company a solid presence in China. The deal generated an impressive revenue, over $1 billion. For John's mentor, it was a crowning achievement, and for John, it was a career milestone, setting him on the fast track in the corporate world. Meanwhile, Diane had been back home in Virginia, attending a high school concert with their boys. John celebrated that evening with colleagues, including Debbie Maris, a sharp marketing rep from another division. He and Debbie had a long-standing, playful rapport, filled with friendly banter. A few drinks in, John felt his usual barriers relax, but his attraction was heightened, not diminished. They danced, closer than any married man should with a woman who wasn't his wife. Debbie pressed against him, her touch lingering, and before long she slipped her underwear into his hand. They made their way to her suite, sharing heated kisses in the elevator. Her blouse and bra were already on the floor as she beckoned him with an inviting smile. But as she unzipped her skirt and held her hand out to him, John found himself paralyzed. A sudden clarity washed over him. He felt an overwhelming sense of loyalty to Diane and a firm realization of what truly mattered to him. He couldn't follow Debbie into that room. He took a step back, then bolted to the elevator. In his own room, he showered, feeling an intense need to erase any trace of the encounter. Despite the late hour in Richmond, he called Diane. She answered sleepily after a few rings. Fighting tears, he shared his career triumph and news of a promotion with a substantial raise. Diane's voice, filled with pride and love, assured him that she had always believed in his success. Her words reminded him that he had almost celebrated one of the greatest moments of his life with the wrong person. As they drove towards the coast, John knew he had to tell her everything. He wanted her to understand his newfound perspective. He could finally empathize with her, fully understanding the trials she'd faced. When Diane returned to the family wholeheartedly, the lingering connection with David Summers faded, becoming a distant memory. Meanwhile, David Summers sat alone in Fred Davis's office at Richards & Sons. Fred, the vice president of human resources, had called David in first thing that Monday morning, leaving David puzzled. True, he had missed a few deadlines in his pursuit of Diane, but he believed he could quickly make up for lost time. This sudden meeting disrupted his carefully laid plans, especially as he hadn't had a chance to talk to Diane about the weekend. Not only had she caught him off guard, but she had sent 2 friends, Janice and Lisa, to confront him. David had been rattled by Lisa, a woman whose sharp tongue and fearless demeanor left even hotel security too intimidated to intervene. As he turned, preparing to leave, his eyes landed on a family photo on Fred Davis's desk. There was Fred, smiling with his 3 sons and his wife, none other than Lisa, the woman who had publicly put him in his place. In that moment, David understood exactly why he was here. This concludes the story. If you like it, then put your powerful like and subscribe to the channel.